one of you could give your own story about what it was like. And I know we could be here all day. Unfortunately, we do not have that time. I did want to give one special shout out to someone, and that's Alana Shepard. During the Olympics, she was the one who married Paralympic Games to the Olympic movement. And that happened here in Atlanta. That's another Olympic legend. This, I hope, will be a conversation. I know we have Andy who likes to talk, and we want to hear his words of wisdom. And I don't want to really go over ground that many of us know. I mean, we've heard the story of how we got the games, and I haven't. Okay, well, then we'll hear it for the first time here today. I'm going to ask this question, and maybe you can get to this first. Describe the energy that existed in Atlanta leading up to the Olympics. Do you want to take that one on, Andy?
No, I want to tell you why we got it.
Okay. See, I've lost control already.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think that I'm a preacher. And when I heard that Billy Payne and Charlie Battle and all were coming in, Horace Sibley, I also heard that Billy Payne had had a heart attack when he was 32 years old and got involved in his church. And he and a group had raised money to build a new sanctuary for the Dunwoody Presbyterian Church. Well, that gave him an authenticity for me. And so when he talked about this, that's the way I think God works. Like, I'm sure God put the Olympics in my blood when I was 4 years old. And here I'm 40-something, or 50 maybe, 60, I don't know what it was, but anyway. And this kid, he's a kid to me. He comes in having had a heart attack and getting this vision. He goes home and sees 17 Days of Glory on television and asks his wife, Martha, do you think we could bring the Olympics to Atlanta? And she says, are you crazy? And that's the way it started. But for me, that heart attack, his work in the church, meant that he was open to crazy thinking, and that's the way God works with us in these strange kind of ways. Now, to add on to it, and I think it all happened the same day, Maggie Womack, who was one of my secretaries, brought me a little book, and there were 85 countries. And I went down the list of countries, and I figured I knew somebody, or knew somebody who knew somebody, in 55 of the countries. So for me, it was a done deal. The Lord had put this on our plate. All we had to do was deliver. And so I was always and Charlie Battle had the same kind of vision because he was operating on a lot of the same information. And it wasn't rational, it was spiritual. And then when 400,000 citizens of this city volunteered over 10 years, that's a religious phenomenon.
So that's the way you would describe the spirit.
That's the way I look at it.
Okay. Edwin, and I meant to introduce, everybody knows Andy Young, but I wanted to just say during the Olympics, Andy Young was chair of the Metro Atlanta Chamber. He was quite the face for Atlanta that way. He also co-chaired the Atlanta Olympics. He's given many great speeches in life. I would say that the greatest speech he ever gave was at the reopening of Centennial Olympic Park after the bombing, where he talked about the spirit of Atlanta and the spirit of belief in our human race and believing in that. So that's probably, again, part of that spirit. Edwin Moses, introduced briefly earlier, I'm going to say a couple of things. A Morehouse man. When I found out he lived in Atlanta, I was like, wow. And I mean, some things to just bring up that you may not know. He's a physicist, and he is in charge, or he helped start all the drug testing for the Olympics, and is still involved in that, I believe. And he is also chair of the Laureus World Sports Academy, which was founded in the spirit of Nelson Mandela, that the world can be united through sports. And he chairs that, living here in Atlanta with help from Mercedes-Benz. So how would you describe the energy that existed in Atlanta?
I had a very unique perspective because I was the American representative on the IOC. I was on the Athletes Commission going back to 1981. Mm-hmm. So at the even the '88 Olympic Games in Calgary, I was a member of, to go in like 2-3 years before and represent the athletes. Right around that time, I remember, I'm not sure if Andy was there or not, but Billy Payne, I think Charlie Battle, and Maynard came to a track and field convention that we had in Washington, D.C., and started talking about they wanted to get the support of track and field for making the bid for the Olympic Games. So I had the perspective of going to the IOC Executive Committee meetings in Lausanne, Switzerland. I had the perspective, I was on the Executive Committee of the USOC. At the same time, we had already made progress on amateur rules. We got those changed in 1981 under Samaranch. He decided that Olympic sports should become professional. It was skiing and track and field were basically the only two. And we were pretty much unregulated back then. So I knew everything that was going on. I actually was on an ad hoc member of the Atlanta Organizing Committee. And so I had a perspective that I could figure out what was going on with the HBCUs and the facilities. And I know that Andy was the guy that he was my role model for what I did for Chicago when they tried to get the bid that Tokyo just hosted. But he went to a lot of countries, especially on the African continent, because there would be no Olympics unless the African countries and a lot of the other not so big countries around the world, like the Malaysias and the Indias, if they didn't agree to have the Olympics in Atlanta, it wasn't going to happen. And so there was a tremendous amount of lobbying going on behind the scenes that really made it possible. And my perspective going back, and I think everyone here is clear on that, there's two things that really made Atlanta the city that it is today: the airport and the Olympic Games. Those two things really changed the whole dynamic. And I've been traveling to Europe since my first trip was like in 1969, I think. And then from the 70s on, I must have had like 200 trips to Europe. But seeing all these European cities and seeing the power of the airport and the transportation systems in terms of infrastructure way back then when I was in my 20s really kind of gave me confidence that the Olympics could be held in Atlanta.
Shirley, I'd like for you to talk about the energy that existed. Many of y'all know her background, former mayor of Atlanta, but during the Olympics, she was senior vice president of external relations and the highest ranking woman on the Olympics team. She, hosting the Olympics got really messy at times, and Shirley was kind of Mrs. Fix-It. To have to make sure that one could negotiate. That was politics. Well, politics is messy, is the last time I checked. But Shirley was a cleanup artist in many ways in trying to bring the community together. Shirley, how would you describe the energy that existed in Atlanta leading up to the games?
So I'm going to follow Andy's lead and answer another question.
Yeah. See, I knew this was going to happen, so I'm going to throw this out.
But I mean, I will talk about the energy of the Olympics. I went to the doctors today for a checkup, and just before I came here, and after he figured out that I could live through the day, which is wonderful at a point in life, I said something to him about, did you watch any of the Olympics? Well, he's very, very efficient. You know that type, right? In and out, only the conversation you have to have, right? He stopped everything and started to talk about his experience at the Olympics. And then I went to get blood drawn, and he followed me over there to talk about it. So the spirit of the Olympics is still alive. And he told me about a patient that he had who was from Vancouver. And when Vancouver was going to host the games, the patient said he was going to stay in Atlanta, he wasn't going back because it would be too much of a mess. And he said, oh no, you have to go back. Because this young doctor was the doctor for the boxing venue. And he said years later, the patient called him and said, best advice he had ever had. The Olympic spirit lifts you up years later. And some of the stories are old stories and some of the stories are new stories. But that's my story today. That the Olympic spirit lifted people up and it brings people together because of the sport, because of the dedication of the athletes. It's obvious how hard they've worked and tried and how hard it is to overcome whatever obstacles present themselves. So I'm really thrilled that I had a chance to work with Andy. And the most important thing I learned, that I don't know everything, right? Andy Young knew it, and fortunately I'd learned to follow. So following is just as important as leading sometimes. And had I not been in Andrew Young's office on those days, I probably wouldn't have learned to follow as clearly. This is the best example in my life of where I was absolutely wrong, didn't know enough to talk about anything. That's another good lesson, right? And then learning to follow. So that's my...
But you knew the city. And
Well,
you knew the players in the city, and you had the respect of just about everybody in the city.
and then
So
I
they
ran for
listened
mayor.
to you.
But I enjoyed the work with people on the ground, if that's what
Yeah.
you want to say.
There's one other thing I'd like to throw in, because Atlanta's corporate base, we couldn't go anywhere in the world and not find Coca-Cola. And they were not supposed to help us, but they did. The other thing is law engineering. R.K. Siegel's not here today. Good.
Who's going to ask the first question?
No, because R.K. was trying to buy a British engineering company with law engineering. And it turned out that the British engineering company had 32 offices in Africa and the Middle East. And nobody in law engineering knew anything about any of those countries. And so R.K. dragged me to London to represent law engineering. I'm still the mayor. To tell them what we knew about all these countries. And I ended up getting a job. But in going around the world trying to mobilize all of these companies to be a part of law engineering, I was meeting with the IOC committees and the national representatives. But I was coming in not trying to get something, but bringing business and ideas. And everything worked together. All things work together for good for them that love the Lord and are called according to his purposes. So y'all can say amen on that.
Amen. So when I was at the AJC, we used to refer to Andy as the only mayor in the United States with a foreign policy.
Atlanta had a foreign policy too, and it was, well, we never traced that nearly like we should, but we had, I think, 44 councils representing other countries. And so that we could call a meeting in Atlanta and have 44 countries represented and then another 10 honorary councils. And so we could almost get half of the countries in the United Nations together in a local meeting. That's a very, very valuable asset for individual businesses, but they attract a lot of business into Atlanta. And when we have conflicts, we usually can go to our consul generals and they can bridge the gap. So we're ready for this and didn't know it.
So I want y'all to give a grade, A to F. How well did Atlanta do hosting?
A
Same thing.
plus.
A. It's all right. Juan Antonio Semeranch is not alive anymore to hear.
Yes, no, he knew. And we shouldn't have expected him to say that we were better than his hometown. He had to go back
To Barcelona.
to Barcelona. And Barcelona was a good Olympics. Every Olympics is a good Olympics, but there's not been a single Olympics that has had as many people in attendance as Atlanta has. Nobody sold as many tickets. Nobody had as many countries represented. Not Russia, not China, not England, not Japan. We were on top in every metric you could imagine. We also raised all of that money privately. There's no city money in the Olympics. And there was no, well, there was corporate money, but I remember Hugh McCall coming in, and he'd just come to town that day, and we had just won the Olympics. And he called up and wanted to come over, and he said, well, what can I do to help? And I said, well, you could be our first sponsor. But I couldn't fix my mouth to say we expected the first sponsor to put up $40 million. Fortunately, Billy wasn't shy. And Billy said, well, our first sponsor we expected $40 million. He said, well, I just paid $90 million to change the name on this bank. I'll probably get just as much good out of the $40 million to the Olympics. And that was the spirit that came from the business community. And then after he got that far, I said, you know, it would help if we had a $300 million line of credit. Now, we don't expect you to come up with it, but we expect you to touch the banking community, and because we don't want to have to borrow money, and we don't want to have to go to the state, the city, or the federal government. And he said, well, I will be responsible for it. Now, here's the way the Lord works. There was a rumor in Italy that the Italian public broadcasting was buying the European public broadcasting for $300 million. They called us, I think, and said, would you take $275 million for the television rights now? We said, yes. But I'm saying it fell in place like it was orchestrated in heaven. And that's the reason I always say this was a religious phenomena that meant to put the blessings of God on this city, and we should never forget it.
So 25 years after the games, how can we recapture that feeling of unity that existed and the sense of purpose that existed as we were leading up to 1996? How would you describe where we are as a city today? And Shirley, I'm going to start with you and we'll go back.
Well, I had a couple other things to say. Andy said the international, if the history of Atlanta, if you look at and I learned this from Horace Sibley, who was on the team, the Cotton States Exposition was the city's first effort to market itself nationally, but also internationally. And so there's been this tradition of Atlanta reaching beyond its borders and beyond Georgia's borders for over 100 years. So I think the foundation that Andy has described is absolutely true. It kind of came together in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then the 2000s. And one of the things that we need to do to move forward is to be sure that we still have that openness to bringing people together from all backgrounds and all parts of our community. And that's hard to, it's easier to do with technology, and it's harder to do because everybody's so busy, and because now we put labels on each other a lot more clearly, and some of that is reinforced by social media and mass media. So we have to be sure that we keep those barriers down as low as possible. Because I didn't grow up in Georgia, but I learned a little bit about Georgia history and Atlanta history. And I believe that Atlanta is the city that it is in part because we were a railroad town. And because with a railroad town early in our history, aside from moving goods and services, railroads move people. So every day that the railroad stopped in Atlanta, new people got off. And they had their stories and aspirations and dreams with them. And somehow or another, this little town, this dusty little town back in the day, embraced that and allowed people to follow their dreams and aspirations and to be included. And the Olympics in 1996 are the best example of how that comes to fruition, with God's help, clearly. And that's what we need to touch and tap into, that we have been open. We have been open for business from the very big, open to new people, open to new cultures, open to new ideas. And the moment we close up, we'll shrivel up.
Okay, Edwin, same question. How can we recapture that feeling that we had in '96?
I think that what Andy said is absolutely true, and what Mayor Franklin said is absolutely true in terms of diversity and the flow of goods and ideas through Atlanta. But I think the city is already experiencing the fallout and the diversity and what happened during the Olympic Games, because we've got NBA championship games here. We've got Super Bowl multiple times, SEC conference championships. We have golf, major golf tournaments, major tennis tournaments. They're having a volleyball tournament this weekend. I want to personally bring back the Morehouse Relays and put track back in the city of Atlanta because of the number of Olympians here. And
yes, let's all clap for that. Let's rebuild.
That are training. There's significant, like Dwight and his group, and they've got a ton of Olympians here. So I think it's already paying off. It's already manifesting itself, and the city's making gravy off of it. We just missed having a fantastic Super Bowl because of the COVID situation just February. But there's more opportunities coming. The convention center is one of the biggest and the best. You know, the Hawks are doing fantastic. 2 new arenas. So all of this has really come because of the financial model that Peter Uberoth and you guys duplicated here in Atlanta, the private, not government financial model, and then having the Olympics in Atlanta to follow up is really just people. Before the Olympics, a lot of people couldn't really identify Atlanta on the map in like the late 80s and 90s. They knew it was in the South, but not much more. But then after the Olympics came, everyone knows Atlanta, as they pronounce it in different parts of the world. It's a different city, a different perception of the city.
So, Andy, how do we recapture that feeling that we had?
I don't think we have to recapture anything. I don't think it ever left. I think it has grown so fast that we haven't understood all that's happening. I mean, when I became mayor, I think we were less than just a little over 1 million people. Now we're in a metropolitan area of about 7 million. Now the significant thing that we have got to realize is impacting us now is our university system. I mean, there's 60, 70,000 students at Georgia State. There are 25,000 at Gwinnett, 40,000 at Kennesaw. Georgia Tech's got 25,000. Emory's. I mean,
Don't forget the AUC.
well, they are about the same size, so they don't have room to expand, unfortunately, and nor money to expand. But that's the other thing, that we have always supported the growth and development of everything in this city. And I'm an admirer of Ms. Shepherd too, because, I mean, you dream it and believe it and you achieve it. And that's what you did with that wonderful health center. And I think that's what all of you have done with your businesses. And just don't ever lose that sense that we're on a revolving planet, and it's not slowing down. And so we have got to manage it. And I think we're going to have to manage it. The key to Atlanta is we don't manage it from Washington. We're managing Washington, believe it or not. I mean, the ideas that are going on in Washington come from Martin Luther King and Jimmy Carter. And they come right out of Atlanta. So, I mean, we got a long way to go. But we're on the way. And if you can produce 400,000 volunteers for 10 years for the Olympics, the Peachtree Road Race produces volunteers. I mean, this city really works on the basis of the spirit of its people.
So my last question, what is the next big idea? Is it hosting another Olympics? Is it becoming the city of peace, which I know is something that Andy and Bob Hope and several in this room have been working on? What is our next big idea? What can we do to galvanize the city to go to that next plateau, like what you did, what all of y'all did, as when we won the games and led up to the games? Andy, we'll start with you.
We're probably the only city that's produced two Nobel Peace Prize winners. And if you add the presence of the Red Cross and CARE and all of the
CDC, Task Force for Global Health, Carter Center.
That peace, becoming a city of peace, is an absolute necessity, because that's the only way you stop the tension which produces crime. I was here in 1966 when the business community, all of them practically happened to have been born here, it seemed, came together, half black and half white, 12, it was 20 of them, 10 blacks, 10 whites, the Action Forum. They wanted to avoid riots and violence, and in 1 week's time, these CEOs produced 6,500 jobs for the summer. And a lot of kids who might have been getting in troubles, they also produced, what was that? We inherited it, Shirley, the summer youth program in the parks. I mean, the work of the YMCA. We've got to provide enough interest and activity to keep everybody moving positively.
Camp Best Friends is what you said. Edwin Moses, what's the next big idea?
I think that the one thing that Atlanta cannot afford to give up, and it behooves us all as a city, a really diverse city that has film. You know, we produce a lot of films here, are able to, the influence and the writing behind the film, the culture, the sports, the intellectuals, you know, the LGBTQI community, the African American community, the Asian community. We're all here in Atlanta. And one thing that we cannot give up, and that's the title of the city, Too Busy to Hate. We can be the phalanx going forward of what a model city can be. And I think that Atlanta, we're going to have to do some work to make sure that everyone knows that this is that place.
And Shirley, your turn.
I think those are great answers. And part of that, I think, is we can't give up and give in to the wealth gap, the disparity gap, the education gap, the health gap, the income gap, and the self-confidence gap, all of that. And I think Atlanta can overcome that. We are stuck, and have been, with too many people having a plateau, reaching a plateau, and they can't break through by themselves. Maybe there are reasons for that, maybe they're not. But we've got to look beyond we've got to look beyond where we are, and cannot go into the rest of the 21st century with 20% or 18% of the people who live in Atlanta and in the metro area living below the poverty line and being stuck in poverty. And this notion that you can do this on your own, perhaps you did it on your own, but I know I didn't do it on my own. I had a whole lot of help along the way. So that's my thing.
So we have time for one question from the audience. So who wants to take on that last one question that we can have?
I have something else. All these people keep getting standing ovations. Why don't we give Alana Shepard a standing ovation?
Here, here. Here, here, here.
Is that the question? Do we have? Okay, we have time for one question. Who's brave enough to ask the one question? RK is not here, so it's up to one of y'all. Okay.
Okay, so actually, my question is to Shirley. Shirley, you've been very modest about, your role, the role you played during the Olympics, but I remember you were probably the most powerful woman at that time. Everybody wanted to have a meeting with you. And then, you fast forward, you worked under Andy's administration, you worked under Mayor's administration, then you became mayor for 8 years. What would you say would be the highlight of your career? Is it the Olympics, the role you played there, or what was it?
Charlie says it was working with him. But clearly working with Andy and Maynard would be the highlights. I mean, I learned more than I could learn in, 20 years of college and graduate school.
They were the highlights because she could plant seeds and watch them grow and water them and nurture them and then tell other people how to get it done. She has far more influence in the shaping of this city than anybody imagines. I mean, because I didn't know anything about Atlanta. I was trying to be mayor because they didn't want another black mayor. And I didn't want to be mayor. Maynard wanted to be mayor, but didn't know what it was to be mayor. But Shirley's, what year was that? 1970, because she started in my first congressional campaign, 1970 to 2020. Are you that old?
Just following your lead.
I did ask her a couple of weeks ago if she would consider running for mayor again, and she said she thought about it, but she said she thought about it but decided no. I'm sorry if I.
3 days. That's 3 days.
But anyway, as you can tell, this is a great panel. We could go on all afternoon. Can we give them all a standing ovation?
Well, they cut me off, but this organization is as important a keystone of this city's growth and development and ideas as anything we've got. So what you decide and what God puts in your heart determines the way this entire region and nation goes. So thank you very much. And just as we've stopped smallpox and malaria and all of that all over the world, Rotary's got a heck of a lot to do here and abroad. And I thank you for your dedication and devotion to this city especially. Amen.